Okay, this is chapter 11, Banner in the Sky. I am laying down. So I'm going to read it to you from a laying down position. You're not going to be able to see me. You can just see the book, Banner in the Sky, chapter 11. There was the sky. There was rock and ice. There was a mountain thrusting upward into blue emptiness. And at the foot of the mountain, a tiny speck. This speck was the only thing that lived or moved in all of the world of silent majesty. Rudy climbed the white slope of the upper glacier. He did not hurry. He looked neither up at the peak nor down at the valley, but only at the ice flowing past beneath his feet. In the ice were the marks of their boot nails from the previous day, and it was easy to follow the route. When the slope steepened, there were the steps cut by Winter and Saxo with their axes. He had only to step up, balance briefly, step up again and again. With the step cutting, it had required 2 hours to reach the Bergschrund. Today, it took him perhaps a third of that time. Coming out on the rim of the great crevice, he approached the snow bridge, tested it, and crossed without mishap. Then, still following the trail of the day before, he threaded his way through the steep maze of the icefall. The Syrinx rose around him in frozen stillness, and Rudy's mind seemed frozen too. What he was doing was not a result of conscious choice or decision. It was simply what he had to do. He had not lost his senses. He knew that alone and without food or a tent, there was no chance on earth of his reaching the top of the citadel. And it was not hope for the top that pushed him on. It was simply, well, he wasn't sure. Perhaps simply the hope to set foot on the mountain. Or more than the hope, the need. The need of his body, his mind, his heart, to come at last to the place of which he had dreamed so long. To stand at the southeast ridge, to follow where his father had led. To climb, perhaps even as high as the fortress, which was as high as any man had gone. That was what he wanted, what he had to have. That much. Before it all ended, before descending to the village, to his uncle's anger, his mother's tears, Klaus Wesselhoff's laughter, to the soap and mops and dishpans of the Bean Sight Hotel. He climbed on. The Syrinx slid past like tall hooded ghosts, and then they dropped away behind him, and he came out at the base of the snow slope. Above him, he could see a trail of zigzagging footprints extending perhaps halfway to the ridge and disappearing into smooth drifts where the avalanche had erased them. The drifts were huge, billowing, dazzling in the sunlight, but he knew that they had frozen overnight and that the sun was not yet strong enough to dislodge them. He shuffled his boots in the snow, and it was firm and dry. As Winter had said, the slope was safe in the morning. Even so, he was cautious as he climbed upward, testing every step before trusting his weight to it. And when he came to the avalanche area, he detoured to the left and kept as close as possible to the bordering rock wall so that he would have something to cling to just in case. But nothing happened. The snow stayed as motionless as the rock. In all that spreading wilderness, there was no movement except that of his only 2 legs plodding slowly on the drifts. And then he stopped. Then there was a movement. He felt it rather than saw it, the merest flicker of a shadow, not on the slope, but on the cliff high above. He tensed, peering upward. A stone fall? No, there was no sound. And then again, there was the flicker, a moving speck of reddish-brown against the tall grayness of the rock. Suddenly it leapt into focus. It was a chamois, Chmois. For an instant, it stood outlined on a crag, motionless, staring down at him, and Rudy, motionless too, stared back. Then the animal moved again, wheeled, vanished. It was as if the cliff had opened and swallowed it, and the stillness closed in again, even more absolute than before. Rudy moved on through the stillness, up the white slope. Kick, step, he went. Kick, step, and though the going through the deep drifts was slow, it was neither steep nor slippery, and his progress was steady. He looked back, and the icefall was far below. Ahead, and the ridge Ahead, and the ridge loomed nearer, and then at last the great moment came, and the slope was beneath him. There was no longer snow under his feet, but solid rock. He took a step up, a second, a third, and stood on the southeast ridge of the citadel. Here he sat down and rested. He pressed his hands against the cold stone as if to convince himself that he was really there, not on its glaciers, not on its approaches, but on the mountain itself. He looked down along the way he had come, and there, beyond glacier and snowfield, forest and pasture, tiny and remote, lay the green valley of Kurtal. On the far side of the ridge, he could now see all the way to the village of Broly. It was as if he were already on a mountaintop with all the world below him until he looked up. And then everything changed. Then he was no longer on a mountain summit, but at a mountain's base, and there was the whole great mass of the citadel still towering above him into the sky. His eyes moved slowly upward across the slanting wilderness of rock and ice. To the right was the east face, to the left the south, two monstrous, almost vertical precipices soaring up out of bounds, out of sight. Between them and joining them was the twisting spine of the southeast ridge, and while this too was steep, it was not so steep as the faces, and was broken up into a maze of towers, clefts, and ledges that at least offered the possibility of being climbed. From where Rudy sat, he could not see the summit of the citadel, nor even close to the high shoulder. Some 2,000 feet above him, the ridge flared up into the bold, broad promontory that was called the fortress, and what lay beyond it was hidden from view. There remained, Rudy knew, fully 2/3 of the mountain, another 4,000 feet of savage rock thrusting up and up into the final pyramid. But in practical terms, it was still as remote from him as when he had stared up at it through the blue miles of the valley below. The fortress was as far as he could see and as far as he could go, if he could go that far. He looked at the sun and estimated it to not be quite noon. If he were to be down safely by dark, he could allow himself perhaps 2 hours for going up? That meant about another hour to get back where he was, 3 o'clock. He figured the times down the snow slope, the icefall, the upper glacier. Yes, 2 hours up, and he could still be down to the hut by nightfall. Beyond the hut, he did not figure. He could not force his mind to think of it. He stood up. He grasped his axe. Then he began the ascent to the ridge. As he had judged from below, it was steep, but not too steep. Indeed, for the first few minutes, the going was even easier than on the snow slope or glacier, and he was able to swing up from boulder to boulder with long, easy strides. This did not last long, however. Soon the gradient sharpened, the boulders gave way to solid rock, and pausing, he slung his axe through his pack straps to give himself the free use of both hands. From here on, it would be real climbing. He worked up a series of stabs and gained 50 feet along a shallow gully for another 50. Then there was a bulge to be rounded and a wall to be scaled, but he chose his route carefully and negotiated both without trouble. Hand and footholds were plentiful. The rock was sound and firm. At the rate he was going, he thought he would reach the fortress in nearer 1 hour than 2. But the rate, of course, did not continue. Presently he came to a pitch of almost smooth rock on which he had to search and grope for every stance. And above this, faced with 2 possible ways around a crag, he chose the wrong one, came out at the base of an unclimbable wall, and was forced to backtrack and try again. The angle of this ridge itself remained fairly constant, but the 2 faces of the mountain on either side of it fell away with an ever-increasing sharp steepness, until his route was no more than a thin, slanting line between 2 gulfs of space. Sheer height, as such, did not bother him, as it would have bothered a lowlander. He could look down without dizziness or panic, but nevertheless he looked down no more than he had to. He concentrated on what lay ahead and made absolutely certain of the soundness of his holds before each upward move. There was an easy stretch, then a harder one. For a distance of some 30 feet, the ridge narrowed to knife-edge thinness, and he was forced to straddle it and push himself up with his hands. Then came a series of towers, or gendarmes, blocking the ridge completely, so that he had to leave it and work his way out into the south face. Here the going was by far the hardest he had yet encountered. Behind and below him was 1,000 feet of emptiness, and often as much as a minute passed while he clung motionless, searching for holds in the smooth granite above. Once or twice he came close to despair. It is impossible, he thought. I cannot do it. But no sooner had he thought it than he heard Winter's voice as he spoke to Staxo in the hut. It has been done before, Winter had said. Rudy's lips tightened, his eyes narrowed. Yes, he knew it had been done before, and he knew who had done it before. He found his hold, pulled himself up, climbed on and on. Beyond the gendarmes, the going was again easier. The ridge broadened, buckled, and slanted skyward like a vast ruined staircase. He moved up through absolute stillness. There was no wind. Now and then a cold tide of air seemed to flow down from the heights above, pressing against his clothing and fingering through the flesh. But the air made no sound. Earth and sky, mountain and valley, the whole world that spread above and beneath him was as transfixed as the world of a dream. And in all of it, only he, Rudy, was awake and moving and alive. He moved on. The stillness deepened. The cold, too, seemed to deepen, creeping through his clothing, through his flesh, into his blood and bones. Suddenly he stopped and turned. He had felt a shadow behind him. But when he looked back, there was only the empty ridge slanting down into the gray distance. He looked up. Was it the sun? No, the sun seemed the same as ever, yellow and flaming in the dark blue of the sky. And yet, his eyes searched the cliffs on the far side of the snowfield. Perhaps he could find the chamois again, find something, anything that lived and moved. But there was only rock and ice, space and stillness. Only the shadow that still hovered above him and the coldness that seemed to touch his very heart. Suddenly fear gripped him, fear far worse than that of falling, fear such as he had never known in his life. I cannot go on, he thought wildly. It is the warning of the mountain, of the demons. He crossed himself, he dropped to his knees, and he closed his eyes. I do not believe in demons, he murmured, but only in the Father who is in heaven, only in him, and in my other Father who has climbed this mountain before me. He waited motionless as the rocks around him, and slowly, blessedly, he felt the fear draining from his body and heart. The shadow was gone. He studied the ridge above him, hitched up his pack, and began to climb. He climbed through the vast stillness alone, and yet somehow he knew no longer alone, for now his two fathers climbed with him. He stepped up, balanced himself, stepped once more, and stopped. Before him, the ridge flared out into a curving, almost level platform, and beyond the platform rose a sheer wall of granite. As Rudy stared up at it, his heart was pounding, for he had reached the fortress. If he was tired and he did not know it, it was growing late. If he was tired, he did not know it. If it was growing late, he did not know it. All he knew, all that mattered, was that he had gained his goal, that he was standing now on the highest point of the citadel that any man had reached before him. A wave of emotion filled him, different from any he had ever known. It brought no need to exult, to yodel, to shout in triumph, as has always happened on the other lesser mountain victories. What he felt was too deep for that, too strong for that. A shout would have been a blasphemy in that secret place which he had come to at last. Slowly his eyes moved upward over the great battlement before him, and he saw that it was indeed like the wall of a fortress, smooth, vertical, and impregnable. With a 50-foot ladder based on the platform, a man could have topped it, but without the ladder, it might as well have been a wall of glass. He looked to the right, where it merged into the east face of the mountain, then to the left, where it joined the south face. And from that moment on, he looked nowhere else, for he had seen what he was looking for. To the left, Captain Winters said. That was Joseph Matt's way, and it would be his, Rudy Matt's way, as well. He moved toward where the platform curved out of sight above the south face, and in a moment he was standing on the edge of an abyss. The platform still continued, or rather a narrow, sloping ledge that formed an extension of the platform, and he carefully followed it around. He took 4 steps, 5, 6, and stopped. The ledge ended, petering out into the vertical walls of the fortress. But from its farthest end, he could see what he had hoped to see, the one break in the great cliff's defenses. No more than 5 yards beyond him, and staring at about the level at which he stood, a long cliff or chimney slanted upward through the otherwise unbroken rock. This, he knew, was the way past the fortress, the key to the upper mountain which his father had found 15 years before. From where he stood, he could not see the inside of the cleft, but its depth and angle were such that was sure he could climb it if he could reach its base. Sidling to the very end of the ledge, he studied the gap beyond. There was no place to stand. He could see that at once. Nor were there any cracks or knobs or handholds, but the wall, though vertical, was not altogether smooth. The rock between ledge and cleft protruded in a sort of wrinkled bulge, and if one could cling to the bulge for as much as a few seconds, it would be possible to worm one's way across. For a long moment he remained where he was, gazing and measuring. Then suddenly he moved. Stepping out from the ledge, he inched out into the bulge, using not only hands and feet, as in an ordinary climbing, but all of his body that he could bring into play. He gripped the rock with arms and legs, pressed against it with chest and thighs, holding on not by any actual support, but by the friction of his moving weight. Space wheeled beneath him. The remote glaciers glinted. But once committed, he could not stop or even hesitate, for such a maneuver had to be made quickly and in perfect rhythm, or it could not be made at all. His clothing scraped against the granite. His knees and elbows churned. His fingers clawed and kneaded. Once he slipped and once more, but both times the friction of his body held him, and a moment later, with a final twist and thrust, he swung off the ledge onto the base of the cleft. His shirt and trousers were torn. His fingers were bleeding, but he scarcely noticed them. All he had eyes for was the long-standing shaft that now rose directly above him, up the sheer wall of the fortress, and yet he thought suddenly, with a great lift of his heart, he had been right. His father had been right. The cleft extended all the way to the top of the precipice. It was climbable. It was the way past the fortress. Instinctively, he started up, and in the next instant stopped. For in that instant, for the first time since he had begun the ascent of the ridge, he thought of the hour. He glanced at the sun and saw that it was halfway between the zenith and the western horizon. Obviously, he had been climbing more than 2 hours, but now much more he could not be sure. But how much more he could not be sure. It is time to go back, he thought. You have to go back. But it was one thing to think about it and another to do it. 100 feet above him, within easy reach, were the upper slopes of the citadel, which no man had ever trod or ever seen. He could not go on up and explore them, that he knew. There was no choice but soon to start down. But first he must have one glimpse, one moment's experience of that high hidden world above the fortress. He moved up again, stopped again. No, he thought, it was too late even for that. He must turn back here. He must start down. But when he moved again, it was still forward and still upward, and the prudence that tried to hold him back was no match for the magic that drew him on. The lower third of the cleft presented no difficulties. Then followed a stretch where it became a sort of narrow, smooth-walled shaft, which at first glance appeared impassable, but after some trial and error he managed it by bracing his back against one wall, his feet against the other, and levering himself upward. Above this in turn was a chockstone, a huge boulder wedged across the cleft, but this too he climbed successfully, and the last third of the way, like the first, was easy. Perhaps 20 minutes after entering the cleft, he emerged at the top onto a flat shelf above the cliff face, the first human being to have passed the grim barrier of the fortress. Now standing there in awe, Rudy Matt looked up at what no man's eyes had seen before. Starting directly in front of him, the southeast ridge, which had been blocked off by the fortress, continued its upward progress, twisting on until at last merged into the great bulge of the mountain's shoulder. So great was the distance that it seemed he was again back at the foot of the peak rather than a third of the way up its flank. But distance in itself was unimportant compared to the other thing he saw, and this was that the ridge appeared climbable to its very end. How it would go from there to the top of the shoulder he was too far away to tell. Nor could he see beyond the shoulder, for the final summit was still hidden behind its jutting cliffs. But up the ridge, at least, the way was clear. There would be problems, of course. There would be obstacles, but no obstacles, so far as he could see, as formidable as the fortress. Nothing that a skilled climber could not successfully surmount. A deep, almost fierce joy welled in the boy's heart. Even though he must now turn back, he had already gone higher into the unknown than any man before him, including his father. He had proved that his father had been right, that there was a way past the fortress, and that it was indeed the key to the mountain. With his own eyes, he had seen the way ahead, leading upward and upward. For another moment, he stood there on the mountainside, alone in the emptiness, alone in the stillness, and then suddenly no longer in stillness, for he had become aware of a sound. He listened, and where silence had been, there was now a low, deep humming. He looked up, and the sky was gray. The sun shrunken and remote. The shadow had returned, the shadow that he felt behind him earlier as he climbed the ridge below the fortress. Only now it was not behind, but all around him. The coldness had returned. Into his bones, into his blood, moment by moment it deepened. The shadow deepened, the humming deepened. From the shoulder of the citadel, high above him, a plume of snow streamed out across the darkening sky. As the end of chapter 11.